So it's my great pleasure today to introduce Dr. Jim Blight and Dr. Janet Lang. As some of you may know, there is an anniversary this month, which will be the topic of our talk today. So just to set up talk, I just want to briefly talk a bit about Jim and Janet's work. First of all, Jim and Janet are creators and practitioners of critical working, which for historians is a particularly interesting methodology, combining traditional or conventional use of documents and so forth, and oral history, and also a method of bringing practitioners, participants, and so forth together in a conference setting to essentially interrogate their shared experiences. So they've done that for all sorts of events, 20th century, their fields of interest, American foreign policy, nuclear disarmaments, and so forth. So that's just a bit of a plug for you.
Thank you, Dan.
ArmageddonLetters.com. You can boot that up right now if you're on the machine or when you go home later on. If you want to find out more about their work on the Cuban Missile Crisis. And also Virtual JFK. Some of you may have been to CIGI last week to see the film. You can also go to the website and learn more about that project. And it's work from their work on JFK that they'll talk about today, specifically what they term JFK's cautious skepticism, his black swan logic. So I'll turn it over to Janet.
Thanks, Dan.
Okay. Thanks, Dan. Thanks very much. We're grateful for the opportunity to come to chat with you, and we're appreciative that there seem to be some that haven't OD'd on JFK up to this part.
They might be here for the muffins. Actually.
They might be there for the muffins. Even we were at risk, my goodness. But actually, one of the things that we found, it was a hypothesis that we made early on, and unfortunately I think it sort of came true, is that most of the work that was out there for the anniversary, the 50th anniversary of Kennedy's assassination, fell into, I'll say, one of three categories. The first one, which was a huge proportion of all the stuff, is what we sort of called the JFK fluff factor. Wasn't he gorgeous? Well, yes, he was. Wasn't his wife gorgeous? Well, of course she was. Didn't they have charming children? Well, of course they did. And if you sort of compare them to Ike and Mamie right before, the geriatric couple, you're going from the AARP to Vanity Fair. It's not a hard story to write.
Easy, we're in AARP now, you know.
I know.
Yeah,
I know the
that's
truth. So it's not a hard story to write. And so a lot of stuff was in that category. But it really is fluff. I mean, it's just sort of the beautiful couple, and then whether or not they really were the beautiful couple, and you've got the Camelot people and the anti-Camelot people, and they're on their horses charging and jaunting with each other. Uninteresting as far as I could tell, frankly. Second group, which is also very large, assassination buffs. Oh, mamma mia. Right? I mean, how many bullets? Where were they? Was it this angle? Was there an umbrella man who's out there when it wasn't even raining? What is going on the knoll? Who did this and who did that? So many possibilities that are truly never ending. Most of this group doesn't ever want to know because it's become either their job or their avocation. And so there's all this conspiracy theories. And there's no question that JFK had a lot of enemies, and we're going to try to tell you a little about how he developed those enemies. But to us, he's dead. I mean, let's just sort of get on with it. The real characteristic of those first two categories, the fluff factor and the assassination buffs, is that President John F. Kennedy gets lost. There's this huge cloud of dust, and you can't see him. And so the third category, the category that talks about who did we lose? Who did his family, who did the world lose on November 22nd, 1963, and might that matter? Might that have mattered? That's our topic. And, you know, not that we're alone by any means in there, but of the three, this is by far the smallest category of things that are out there. So what we really want to get to say, and by the way, thank you, Dan, for talking about our two previous projects. Our current one is JFK's Backbone, jfksbackbone.com. And as you can see, basically part of what we're saying is you don't know jack, and it's not your fault, because all the stuff that's out there is a cloud of dust. And so what we want to do is try to use this time to have you get to know Jack in a couple of interesting ways. And we thought that one way that might be interesting to sort of start the process actually comes from our Armageddon letters. And it's a short, very short, 5-minute film that's called Be Kennedy.
How does John F. Kennedy think
Is that okay?
during the Cuban Missile Crisis? You need to know one thing about Kennedy before we move directly to the crisis, and that is what he did as a young man in the South Pacific. John F. Kennedy could not get into the Army, Navy, Air Force. He had to pull all kinds of tricks, and his father had to exert his influence and probably pass along a little money to get him in. He was unhealthy. He had a lot of health problems. But he got in. Right in the middle of the war in 1943. He was shipped off to the bloodiest zone of the war, the South Pacific, where the U.S. attempt to retake certain islands had already begun, that had been captured by the Japanese earlier. And what Kennedy witnessed while he was in the South Pacific is in his letters that he wrote to girlfriends, to his mother, to his father, to his brothers. His PT boat is going all over the islands, and what he picks up every day, he's in the Pacific, is that the Japanese, when confronted with overwhelming military power, they refuse to capitulate. In fact, they will commit suicide before they will allow you to take them prisoner. And that includes civilians. People are falling on grenades and being exploded. People are joining hands as families and neighborhoods and leaping off cliffs to their death below. Island after island was taken by the Marines, only to find dead bodies everywhere, bodies that they did not kill, along with some that they did. This was totally unnerving to the Americans. This is Kennedy's frame of reference. You cannot depend on the enemy to capitulate just because you have overwhelming power. The Japanese refused to capitulate until the threat existed that the entire country would be nuked. Kennedy brings that kind of experience to the Situation Room in the White House as president in October of 1962. Kennedy now is confronted with General Curtis LeMay. Curtis LeMay was a war hero. He was the guy who designed the program that dropped all the bombs, including the nuclear bombs, on Japan. He is now the Air Force Chief of Staff during the Cuban Missile Crisis. LeMay comes into Kennedy and says, "Mr. President, it's time to go to war." Kennedy is a bit shocked. He says, "Well, General, what do you suppose the Russians will do if we bomb all those missile sites in Cuba, for starters?" And LeMay says, "They won't do anything because we've got superior power. And they know, and we've let them know, that we have massive nuclear superiority, so they won't do anything. They're not suicidal. They're not going to do anything." You can almost imagine Kennedy listening to this little speech by LeMay. In fact, you can actually listen to LeMay because it's on tape. LeMay is telling his president, "You don't have any other option, Mr. President. I'm sorry to have to tell you this, but you have got to go to war, and you've got to go to war now. The quicker, the better." Better to surprise him. He's appalled because he knows that massive, overwhelming power does not necessarily lead the enemy to capitulate. And this time, unlike Japan, which had no nuclear weapons, this time he knows that the enemy has got a lot of nuclear weapons, and this general is telling him on faith or on because of arrogance or just ignorance, he doesn't really care why, but he's telling him this, that it's okay to start a war with the Soviet Union because they won't do anything. Kennedy, with that experience in the Pacific, says to LeMay, you got to come up with a different plan. We are not going to attack Cuba tonight or tomorrow night or anytime soon, and I just don't believe you, he says, when you say that the Russians will do nothing.
I love the part where I'm in the Pentagon Situation Room and they're all listening. It's a scholar's dream that never comes true, probably just as well. It's been more than 25 years since we first began to examine the secret tapes that Kennedy made during his administration. In the summers of 1986 and 1987, McGeorge Bundy, the then National Security Advisor, and I showed up at the library, Kennedy Library, 5 days a week. I was not allowed to look at them because I didn't have clearances. Bundy could look at them because he was on the tapes and he had clearances. And so he would take notes with his pencil, and he brought these awful, what is that stuff?
Bluefish.
Bluefish watercress sandwiches on white bread with mayonnaise. I am lucky to be here today after having absorbed that. And Bundy and I would talk during the lunch hour. What he wound up doing, this is all leading to the how Kennedy's decision-making is much more grounded in factual material than almost any other public figure I can think of. He decided that he was getting on in years, so he transcribed all the tapes from October 27th, 1962, the day that it looked like nuclear war might break out, but also the day that the elements of a solution first appeared. He wrote it all out. He had it transcribed by his secretary, who also had clearances because she goes back to the government. That's how far back they went. He gave it to us and said, take the weekend, read it over, give me a call, and tell me what surprised you.
We were taking an exam from McGeorge Bundy.
Bundy wanted
We
to
were a
know
little nervous.
if what we were surprised by was what he was surprised by, and he wasn't going to tell us until we told him. It was easy. Kennedy is so far out in front of his advisors on what could happen, what might happen, what probably will happen. He's all the way out. I mean, he's light years beyond them, and he's trying to bring them around. So you even have people like George Ball, who was a famous peacenik in the months leading up to the deployment of all the troops in Vietnam under Johnson, saying you can't include a trade of the Turkish missiles because Turkey will drop out of NATO, and if Turkey drops out, well, you know what the French, they want to drop out anyway, and there goes NATO, there goes the Western world, there goes everything. And Kennedy's response is, well, maybe so, George, but if there's anybody around to write the history of this after it's over, I mean, really, those Turkish missiles, when they find out we could have gotten out of this by trading in that junk that the Turks love so much for its symbolic value, I don't think we're going to have a really good war here. Now, that was the beginning of a different kind of understanding of this guy. The image that we got when we were in graduate school at the Kennedy School was that Kennedy was a hawk. Kennedy's speeches are full of challenging rhetoric about paying any price and bearing any burden for freedom around the world, blah, 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 blah. Yeah, he was a politician. He had to get elected. He got less than half the vote, and in some people's estimates, he didn't really win the election. But anyway, he was president. However many times people in Cook County, Illinois got to vote, we don't know. But or how much his father, there was an old joke in the family that Kennedy's father was willing to pay for an election, but not a landslide. Well, now, what we began to see is a guy who's totally different than this cute, beautiful sort of guy with a great haircut, with good rhetorical skills, all of that stuff. What we see is a guy who is tough as nails. The people who are pushing him are all war heroes. This is only 17 years after the end of the Second World War. Curtis LeMay not only torched Japan, but he torched Germany. He's the guy, along with Bomber Harris of the British Air Force. And so they burned up Japan, and then they went and burned up Germany, which, you know, we look back on and we think, oh my God. At the time, these guys were great war heroes because of the view that if they hadn't done that, maybe in Germany, maybe not. Certainly in Japan, it would have cost the Americans 1 million more casualties, 1 million more casualties. Now, so they come to him and say, we got to go. And why do we have to go? Because we have about 5,000 deliverable nuclear weapons, and they have a couple hundred maybe. And so that in itself is reason enough to do anything we want in crisis conditions, because they'll know better than to challenge us. And that is the one key to understanding Kennedy. He never believes this for a minute. He's already seen that this is, in a sense, if you believe that one disconfirming event can disconfirm the whole damn theory, he's already seen it, and he saw it every day in Japan. The day he arrived in the Solomon Islands, a kamikaze plane went directly for their ship. He hadn't even gotten off the ship yet. Guy went down, they reached out and they tried to bring him on board. The guy reappeared with a flotation device and began with an automatic weapon trying to kill all the people on board until somebody blew his head right off his body. This really made people nervous. How are you going to deal with people with that degree of commitment? Well, 6 times at least during his administration, during the Bay of Pigs in April of 61, Laos in the spring of 61, during the construction and the aftermath of the construction of the Berlin Wall beginning 13 August 1961, in the not very well known but very interesting approach by his advisors in November of 1961 to try to, in a way, to surround him, not let him out until he said, we will Americanize the war in Vietnam, we will send combat troops. McNamara wrote a memo, which he soon pulled back, but the memo was out, suggesting that Kennedy think in terms of 205,000 men, a man commitment to South Vietnam in the near future, beginning with 10 or 15,000 now. Kennedy gave him nothing. By way of combat troops, he gave him helicopters and planes and lots of trainers. 16,000 by the time he was assassinated. But no troops arrayed in combat formation. The Cuban Missile Crisis, enough said on that, I guess. And then in October of 1963 began a pullout. The first 1,000 were pulled out by Christmas. There was a newsreel made of it. They actually came out even though he was assassinated, and Johnson had a much different view of what the war was about. And now, the question arises, and we will deal with this in a kind of theoretical context, but try to keep it factual. On all of these things, so what would Kennedy have done if he had lived? Back to Janet's point, and then back to Janet. You cannot address that question until you immerse yourself in what he did. This is a different kind of sort of what-if history. You can't just say if Napoleon had had a decent air force, he'd have done better at Waterloo. I mean, you can say it, but this is basically the sort of intellectual sophistication of a lot of counterfactual stuff. I mean, we're for it because we don't see how you can get around it. But it's not based on anything except, you know, the cleverness that comes with sophomores in dorm rooms very late at night trying to do one-up on each other. That's what it's about. So we'll try to stick to the facts. But our basic view is Kennedy, before he was assassinated, would have borne a lot of resemblance to the Kennedy he would have been after he was assassinated. And a guy who wasn't going to be pushed into war on the first 6 tries, we don't think he was going to be pushed into war at all. And that's what we missed, because 3 million people died in Southeast Asia alone. To say nothing of the other millions all over the world who died during the Cold War after that point. Remember, the Cold War wasn't cold at all. It was just cold in Moscow and Washington. All over Central America, all over Africa, all over the Middle East, East Asia, there are wars going on, supported by the US and Soviet Union in the context of the global Cold War. Mwah.
All right, so what we're talking about in our new project, one way we have to think about it is what we call a tale of two backbones. So Jim has given you sort of an outline of, in a sense, JFK's metaphorical backbone, that the hawks, both military and civilian, pressure him. And, you know, he's a good politician. He doesn't want to fight battles that he doesn't have to. He gives them a little bone every now and then. Bottom line, 0 combat troops whenever they've requested it. There's one other thing that comes out about JFK's metaphorical backbone, and that is in the Bay of Pigs, which was just a disaster, often called a perfect failure, in fact, where you had Cuban exiles rushing, that the CIA trained, rushing to this swamp, wonderful location in Cuba, and thinking that once they got on the swamp, the Cuban population would say, "Yay, we love you," and depose Castro. Well, of course, nothing like that happened. Within about 72 hours, the Cuban exiles are rolled up. They are either dead or in jail. This comes only a few months after Kennedy's been elected. Remember, he's following Eisenhower, who is the geriatric guy, but it's General Eisenhower who won the war. And here's this punk lieutenant who can't even win Cuba, right? So it was really politically very, very dicey. Moreover, during the Bay of Pigs, as the exiles are getting decimated, there just happens to be naval ships, U.S. naval ships, with combat troops on it, about 2 to 4 miles away, and the Navy is screaming at JFK, "Send them in, send them in." The CIA thought if they backed Kennedy into a corner, and once boots were on the ground, the exiles, and they were dying, that Kennedy would have no choice. Kennedy said no. He took an incredible political hit because there initially really were talk of impeachment. But one of the very bizarre things that happened, 2 days after the whole thing is kind of out there, he goes and gives a talk that he was scheduled to give to the main people of the press in Washington, and he takes the blame. He says, "I'm the officer in charge, and there you go. We'll learn from this," and so on and so on. About a week or so later, this is really bizarre, his ratings go up to 83%. Approval ratings, right? So he took a political hit, was ready to take a political hit, but he actually ended up transmogrifying that into something different. But the man has a metaphorical backbone. The man also has a physical backbone that is deteriorating. I mean, Kennedy, again, you have this image of sort of the beautiful guy, vigor, playing touch football.
She does the
sailing.
accent perfectly because she was born in his congressional district.
It's true.
When I met her, she said vigor.
Vigor. But anyway.
This would be the history department.
But Kennedy, in many ways, is the great deceiver. It is absolutely phenomenal what he, his family, and his political machine do to hide his horrible health. I mean, Kennedy is a sickly kid from the get-go. Just before he's 3 years old, he gets scarlet fever and he's given the last rites of the church. I mean, they just thought he was a goner from then on, and it only gets worse. Basically, by the time he's 14, sort of 14 to 17 is just a horrible time. He's at a big prep school in New England, but he's also a lot in the hospitals. Now, his dad is one of the richest men in the country at that point. You can imagine that he is getting the best medical care you could buy. He goes to the Mayo Clinic. He's there for at least 6 weeks. They just turn him inside out, and his letters to his friends are amazing. They are so graphic and so full of gallows humor that he said I think they've given me up for dead, and you wouldn't believe how many enemies I've had, and blah, 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 blah.
She taught me how to interrupt. I was born in the Midwest where interrupting is called interrupting. Janet's from an Italian household in Boston where interrupting is called active listening. So I'm going to, no, you must read these because they are on the outer edge of what constitutes, even now, tastefulness. But there's one in particular where so-and-so took this and shoved it up and then shoved it up further and then kept shoving it up further. And it was only at the end I could see that she was actually pretty good looking, so I forgave her for that.
So Kennedy, I mean, partly at this point, he is just a sick kid. I mean, he's got horrible, horrible GI problems. He can hardly eat. He's not gaining weight. He's this skinny, tall little thing. He's, close to 6 feet, and maybe he weighs 120 pounds. I mean, he looks like a cadaver. He has very, very low blood counts. At one point, they think he might have leukemia. He doesn't. But the main thing here is that he's feeling awful. It comes unbidden, so then it'll go away. It's totally unpredictable. The doctors are trying X, Y, Z. They're the best experts in the world. He concludes they don't know a damn thing. He starts appreciating, don't trust experts. They just, they're doing their best shot, but really, ignorance is overwhelming their expertise. He learns this viscerally. Other thing, with all of his hospitalizations, and basically, if you imagine the time that Kennedy was in the White House, about three years and change.
1,036 days.
1,036 days. Roughly for about that same time, he was in hospital or deep rehab. And that's probably an underestimate. So he's got lots of time. It's the time before there are Blackberries or iPhones or any of those things. And so he's essentially, for example, when he's in the Mayo Clinic, he's alone. His family's not there. He reads. He's really a smart kid. He reads. What does he read? Well, one of the most interesting things that he reads again and again and again is Winston Churchill, The World Crisis, 1911 to 1919. Churchill's a participant there, and he's reflecting on the utter absurdity of this war, the colossal way in which the world stumbled into this war, and that the cost was exponentially higher than anything they thought at the beginning. Kennedy loves Churchill. He quotes Churchill like crazy. And this whole notion of that is really also very, very key to sort of how he's thinking about things. Then later he gets his Pacific experience, which you've seen, and then Jim told you about that. Basically, his conclusion there is both about the asymmetry of force, that force doesn't always win, but also that when an order is given to do X, don't bet on X happening. Bet on Y, Z, K. That it's so easy to start something, but it goes out of control very quickly. Okay? And this is before the issue of symmetric nuclear exchanges, right? So he's just, at this point, he's aware of carnage and difficulties and don't trust experts, and he's very skeptical. And then as president, he brings all of this plus nuclear danger, okay? So this is what we call Jack's black swan logic. Now, a black swan, there's a wonderful book called The Black Swan by Nassim Nicholas Taleb. It's mainly, almost exclusively, on financial issues. And what we've done is to take Nassim's notion of black swan logic and apply it to U.S. foreign policy, particularly to presidential decision-making in matters of war and peace. Black swan event is low probability. I mean, every swan you've ever seen, unless you're in Australia, is white. Maybe you saw a picture of, I bet, swans are white, swans are white, swans are white. Okay? So it's low probability, but it's a high impact, low probability event. And one of the ways that Nassim has of illustrating this, which is my favorite, it's called the turkey problem. Okay? So here's this turkey, and he's being raised. Oh, yeah.
You're mobile.
Yeah. So here's this turkey, and he's being raised by a butcher. Okay, this guy that loves him, that feeds him. All the data that he sees every day is, oh my God, do I have a wonderful life? I mean, this guy, he's better and better, and he cares for me, and it's just, I mean, life is so wonderful. Holy shit, I'm dead. Right? Behind the butcher is this incredible black swan that's lethal. And he's clueless about it. Yeah. So Kennedy, in a sense, one way to describe Kennedy is that in matters of war and peace, Kennedy sees black swans where his advisors don't. His advisors, let's say LeMay, maybe he doesn't like this. LeMay's more like this. You can do that. There's no problem. They won't do anything. You can bomb them. You can take down the wall in Berlin. Khrushchev won't do anything. They won't do anything. If Kennedy had followed that, oh shit, a nuclear war. Right? Kennedy is very nervous about those things. Now, the one key point about Kennedy's black swan logic is that it leads to what we call heroic non-action, which is really hard to deal with politically. How do you get credit for what you didn't do? I mean, it really takes amazing political skills, and we can go into that later on that. But he was darn good at that. But it's heroic non-action, and the issue is that now, because of historical work, that some of which we've done, some of our colleagues have done, both in the U.S. and in Moscow, Havana, Vietnam, where we know what was going on in those crisis situations. We know that Kennedy was right and LeMay was wrong. Khrushchev would not have sat by and done nothing if, for example, during the missile crisis, Kennedy had bombed a particular site. There were 40,000 Russians there. CIA thought there were 5,000. There were nuclear weapons there, particularly tactical nuclear weapons. CIA thought they probably weren't there. There were nuclear weapons that were aimed at Guantanamo. Clueless, right? But Kennedy he's worried about what he doesn't know. That's the classic aspect of a black swan logic. So if you get a sense of sort of get to know Kennedy, look at what he did, much more so than what he says. I mean, he says a lot of things to a lot of people for a lot of reasons. He's a politician. He has to get elected or he can't do anything. But really focus on what he did. Then you sort of have the right, we think, to ask this more provocative question.
Yeah, so what if you'd lived? This is very, as historical subjects go, this is pretty loaded. And when we first, we had a first cut of the movie Virtual JFK with our director, Koji Masatani. Some people saw it as an anti-Johnson film because the movie is about 2/3 Kennedy and 1/3 Johnson. But it wasn't our intent, and we'd made a few adjustments. But in fact, Johnson wanted to know how to win the war, and Kennedy never thought of it that way at all, winning somebody else's war. He'd already been there in 1951 and recommended to the French that they get the hell out as soon as they could because this was going nowhere. The French lost over 100,000 people dead during the war between the end of the Second World War and their departure in 1954. I mean, that was another piece of his experience that showed that you get into something, the wheels start, there's sand in the gears, you can't get out, it gets difficult, you got sunk costs, you're accused of not honoring the dead if you retreat, all that sort of, he knows all about that. I mean, he's been there, done that. So the question is, how do you do this in kind of you ask the what-if question in a responsible way. In this is the book that went with the movie, or was it the movie that went with the book? I forget. But actually, in some ways, they don't have a lot to do with each other, except they have the same title.
And conclusion.
And conclusion. One of our, we have a lot in common with John here, one of which is our unending admiration for Fred Logevall, the now Pulitzer Prize winning Fred Logevall of Cornell, who has done a lot on the Vietnam War and what you can legitimately ask and expect to have a rational discussion, and what you cannot and expect to have sort of a useless discussion. What we say in here, let me just, it says, there are two kinds of assignments. I guess we'll always be professors. You can't do it. What else can you do but be a professor? This is your assignment. So here it goes. So what happened with regard to Vietnam if Kennedy had lived? Just Vietnam now. It's an essay exam. Be as creative as you like. Make sure you tell a good story, or at least a strange story, or an arresting story, and don't neglect to include a few facts with the fiction, because you want to appear credible. Don't worry whether people actually believe you or not, because no one can prove you're wrong.
So this is the boo-hiss aspect.
Don't take it seriously. It's only a game.
And that's usually called counterfactual history.
Right.
And so that's boo-hiss.
I mean, another guy, Yale historian John Gaddis, a serious historian, questionable political proclivities, but still a serious historian. In the middle of a comment about the Korean War, he starts talking about the nuclear bombs that were dropped on North Korea. And I mean, I was like a page or two into this before I realized, this is bullshit. He just made, wait a minute. And so then you begin to wonder, why is he doing this? Well, what we call virtual history goes a different way. So, would there have been an American war in Vietnam if Kennedy had lived? True? False? True or false? Why or why not? You're allowed to argue your case only with reference to the evidence. Be prepared to defend or amend your argument with reference to what's known or believed that bears on the issue, and in response to cross-examination from your peers, because this exercise is serious and it might even be important, so be careful. We were on last Friday something called Huffington Post Live, about what if Kennedy had lived. And Nick, I don't remember Nick's last name, he edits Reason magazine. He operated in a data-free zone. Every time somebody said something, he says, well, you can't prove that. You just can't. You know. Right. Which means, I gather, that you're not allowed to talk about history, to bring history to bear on anything, because you can't prove it. And besides, even though he's way too old for this, he just reminded me of my college roommate, this jerk who just would stay up all night, argue into a hole, say, oh, I give up. I'm coming out of the flag. Yeah, just anyway. But he didn't know anything about Kennedy. And I thought, who asked this clown onto the show? Well, I guess they needed some adversarial sort of things. But this subject, here's a question for historians and budding historians. This subject seems to us to be uniquely almost given to us as a kind of paradigm for virtual history. The question is whether it really applies to anything else. Because we have a decision maker who made decisions on more or less the same kind of issues he was going to make decisions on after he was killed. And he was killed like now. There was no disease, there was no decline, nothing. He was just himself, and 6 seconds in Dallas and he was gone.
But you have a database
right.
of how he worked in the crucible of when War and Peace is on the line.
Second, Lyndon Johnson, for reasons that many of you probably know, and if you don't, we can discuss it, he kept all the Kennedy people, with the exception of Bobby Kennedy, who wouldn't be kept, and Ted Sorensen and Arthur Schlesinger, who were Kennedy's court historians, who didn't want to be there anyway. So he kept the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of State, the National Security Advisor, the whole CIA director, they're all in there.
Military.
And so all the military people are the same. And so you've got a kind of, this is as close as you're going to get to a controlled sort of environment or experiment. And so we have tried to come up with other situations.
Oh, but wait, but finish out the idea. So here's this national security apparatus.
I thought I had finished that idea. I hadn't, did I?
Not
She's
quite.
right. She's right. She's right.
Here's this national security apparatus that's there. and Kennedy is operating in it.
Yeah.
And then, poof, we take Kennedy out, we plop Johnson in, and it's essentially a quite similar national security apparatus. His advisors, the advisors continue to give hawkish advice to Johnson. Kennedy, as you saw in the little video, just sort of like, wait a minute, where's those black swans and whatever. Johnson hasn't a clue about a black swan. He really doesn't. He basically, more often than not, accepts the advice of his military. The most he usually will do is if the military wants X, he gives them X divided by 2. So it's a very different kind of presidential decision-making with regard to war and peace. Just a final other little difference is that for you, again, historians and budding historians, we can say that, quote, he kept the same advisors. And he did keep the same people. But those people are very different when they're interacting with Kennedy, who loves criticism, very confident, doesn't mind if you disagree with him. He'll just sort of, okay, whatever. Johnson loathes criticism. He's very much more thin-skinned. And so the people adjust. I mean, it's a very, very interesting situation. But anyway.
Yeah, well, Bob McNamara won under Kennedy. Can be heard on the tapes to interrupt the president all the time. He doesn't mind. In fact, he encourages it. He can't stand to be around people who go, yeah, Mr. President, yeah, Mr. President. Boring, out of here. You go on the tapes at the Kennedy Library and just kind of queue up like one a month from the time Johnson takes over. The phone conversations, Johnson taped phone conversations, so when you're sitting there, it's like Johnson is right there. The Kennedy tapes are really fuzzy and wuzzy and difficult, and they'll never be transcribed with 100% confidence. Johnson, it's easy. As long as you know Texas Hill Country English, you're going to have to use some discretion there. But McNamara is tamed, and you can see it going on. Bob McNamara, the active, super technocrat, the guy who's going to be the action man to make sure the withdrawal from Vietnam occurs, is going to be the action man, a lot of different things. He keeps interrupting Johnson and saying things like, but the problem with that, Mr. President, and it's as if he's not even there. And Johnson just keeps right on going, and then you hear, yes, Mr. President, click. That happens about the middle of February 1964. And after that, McNamara has transformed himself because he doesn't have much of an ideology. He doesn't even know much, really, about history or anything. Unlike some of the hawks who got really good Cold War reasons for wanting to go smack the Russians around, he basically just wants to do what the boss wants to do. And he wants to be the first guy to figure out what the boss wants to do. He figured this out about Kennedy, and that's why Kennedy in the Cuban Missile Crisis said, Robert McNamara is my MVP. He kept those son of a bitches in the room, he locked the door, and he wouldn't let them out until this damn thing was over, and I'm so glad he did. All the way from that until Johnson says, Bob, you got to win the war for me. And at a certain point, he says, we'll give it a shot. And 500,000 troops. I mean,
So our conclusion.
What is it?
From our conclusion, just in doing our type of virtual history, is that Kennedy is 0 for 6 in terms of combat troops while he's alive. Had he lived and number 7 is Vietnam, he's going to be 0 for 7. Unless he becomes not Kennedy. That's what it would take. It would take Kennedy really not being Kennedy, not having his backbone of either kind. I want to end with one other notion about Kennedy's 2 backbones. We think that there's also an interesting way in which they're fused. So the revealing of Kennedy's ill health, his Addison's disease, he's just a very sickly guy.
He's a disabled man. He's a disabled president who's successfully hidden this. You couldn't do that today, but he did it.
So it went from sort of an expose of, did you know that Kennedy was this sick? And oh my God, and he's taking all these pills, and he's maybe a drug addict, and oh my God. phase one. Phase two, Robert Dallek is the historian of record here who's done a wonderful, wonderful job of really looking at all the disabilities, in a sense, that Kennedy had. And he has an interesting conclusion. He says, you know, I tried to look to see if being on drugs or being in this intense pain ever created a situation where Kennedy made a bad decision. And I don't think so, because I conclude that Kennedy just toughed it out. That's phase two of understanding. We're in phase three. We think that Kennedy's experience from the time he's in his prep school all the way up through as long as he lived, the diseases that he had, the way he had to cope with them, the pain and so forth, we call it his back boot camp, or body boot camp, actually. And that it's basically a physiological situation that really gives him the way that he thinks about crises. It's how he first gets into his black swan logic. And so our sense is not that he made good decisions in spite of his deteriorating backbone, et cetera, but that he made them because of, that it was actually a positive thing. So not that you want anybody to have a life like Kennedy had in all kinds of ways, which we won't go into, but the issue is, can we reproduce JFK's metaphorical backbone in some other ways? And we sort of thought a little about that. We could talk about that in some questions, but we probably won't allow more time for questions if we keep blabbing, so we'll stop here.
Questions? Sure.
I have two questions. Your material is very impressive, if I may say so. I have two questions.
You may. Yes, thank you.
One you might be more interested in than the other one. One's about the assassination itself, and the other one is about the Bay of Pigs. In terms of the assassination, are you comfortable at all discussing what you think happened on November 22nd, and who may be responsible?
No.
We're some slight differences here.
I mean, I don't have a clue. To me, it can go any way. He made tons of enemies because of his backbone.
There are certain candidates that always keep coming up. I mean, of course, Oswald's in the sixth floor window. He's shooting. He probably was involved. The mafia, they want back in Havana. Havana was going to be what Las Vegas became, the gambling capital of this hemisphere. And Castro kicked them out, and so therefore Kennedy's got to kick Castro out, and the only way to do that is to invade, throw them out, occupy the country, and start all over again with somebody who's more congenial. The CIA, after the Bay of Pigs, he gets rid of the director, he gets rid of the deputy director for operations. Allen Dulles, the only director the CIA ever had, he's gone. The brother of the former Secretary of State. And Dick Bissell, Richard Bissell, the guy who kind of oversaw this, he's gone. His career is over. It shows two things. One is Kennedy's tough. Another thing is everybody in the operations side, the dirty trick side of the CIA, had a very dim view of the Kennedys and what they were willing to do. And the Cuban exiles, at least the gung-ho, the real crazies in Dade County, but remember, they're not, during this period, the third largest Navy in the world operated out of Coral Gables, Florida. And that was a CIA-run Navy at the disposal of the more firebrandish Cuban exiles. And they are just flaming, there's hatred of this guy who was given two beautiful opportunities at the Bay of Pigs and then the Cuban Missile Crisis. My God, Khrushchev manufactured the perfect situation to go in and knock off Castro. Well, now these people keep coming up in all these elaborate theories. Is it reasonable that a lot of them wanted to kill Kennedy? I mean, yes, they did. I mean, they wanted him dead. How do we get Sam Giancana in Chicago connected with Johnny Rosselli and this sort of thing? I don't know. And every year in Dallas, The lone gunman people meet in one hotel, and the conspiracy people meet literally in another hotel, and then, you know, they all get drunk together at the end, and nobody convinces anybody of anything. So that's...
I will actually
you know.
add one teeny part, because all this stuff is beyond me.
She's Italian. She actually knows who did it.
No, I mean, it's just like, good God. The one part I would add, again, it's consistent with our project, JFK's backbone.com, by the way. Actually, a key culprit in this was Kennedy's brace, back brace. His back was killing him during that trip. And if you actually see some of the early footage when he is landing in Dallas, Fort Worth, he's kind of limping. So he's wearing this brace that is so cinchered. I mean, he's like a Victorian woman that can't breathe. Okay, he's like that. Now, what does that have to do with his death? Well, everybody agrees the first bullet was not lethal. If he is you or me
Right through his neck.
and doesn't have the brace on, the first bullet comes and he flops, right? But he can't flop. The brace won't let him flop. The brace secures him in this position so that he stays in that incredible target area for a very long time, and poof, there goes his cortex.
Yeah.
But now tell me about the Bay of Pigs.
Yeah, I was at your presentation the other night, and I recall you saying, the people who killed him.
Yeah.
People.
And I've been thinking about
Yeah.
that ever since.
Oh, indicating that
More
than Lee Harvey Oswald.
Right.
Yeah, okay.
So that's
Having a
usually
clue.
there's more than one, I'm thinking.
Wash your mouth, my
I am,
sweetheart.
I am.
Yes, right now, because we haven't a clue.
Right.
Okay, Bay of Pigs question.
You've indicated today that you're pretty confident that his non-action in the Cuban Missile Crisis was a wise thing. Do you also, I recall, I think somebody said, when he met privately with Richard Nixon, Nixon said to him, well, find some legal cover and go in.
Yeah.
Do you think his non-action in the Bay of Pigs was justified in terms of the Russians taking Berlin and so on?
Oh yeah, yeah. We so we met in it would be the 40th anniversary in 2001. We finally we did a conference in Havana on the Bay of Pigs. In some ways, it was the most interesting of all the conferences we've done. In some ways, not. I don't think we learned a lot of things, except that you could sense the degree of preparation by the Cubans, which always kind of gets, it's called a perfect failure. It's as if the Cuban Cubans, I mean, the Cubans on the island, like, didn't do anything to make it a failure. No, they figured this out. At first, they couldn't believe the invasion was at the Bay of Pigs, which is one of the most inaccessible, ridiculously swampy, untraversable parts of the island. And so, what are you going to do when you land them there? Well, see, what they didn't quite focus on was that they were supposed to have radio equipment. They would radio back to Miami. Miami would tell Washington. They'd say, oh, the free Cubans have arrived, and therefore the U.S. Air Force follows quickly, and the U.S. Navy and the Marines and so forth. And that's so that on this raunchy little beach on the southwest side of the island, that would be, for a while, that would be free Cuba. That would be like free Berlin, and then it would expand out and so forth with the help of the U.S. Marines. We now know, I mean, the Cubans had 200,000 militiamen under arms, 200,000. Now, can the U.S. overwhelm that? Sure. But what are you going to do? You're going to have to go into the jungles. You're going to have to go into the Sierra Maestra in the east. You're going to have to go into the Sierra Escambray, the hills in the central part, and you're going to have to root out an insurgency. And what happens to the Alliance for Progress? What happens to Kennedy's efforts to sort of improve the image of the United States from the ugly American that was formalized in the book in 1958? Well, it's gone. It's totally gone. And it would have been one Cuban general whose name is Ulysses Rosales, retired general, he's still alive, said, he said, if I may say so, I will. If you had come into Cuba with a full invasion force, there wouldn't have been enough left of you to have a Vietnam War, because you'd have had your damn war on our island. Most of us would have perished, but by God, none of us would give up. And there was no evidence to the contrary. I mean, fighting the United States of America for Cubans of that generation, they lived for it. They lived for it. And so, did he make the right move? Yes, he did. But that was tough. there were really people talking impeachment. Just as this morning, as a matter of fact, I read that several right-wing think tanks in Washington have thought about now impeaching Obama for endorsing the deal with Iran. We'll just see if Obama's made out of the stuff that Kennedy was. We hope.
Other
Good
questions?
questions.
John?
John?
Thank you very much for your talk. We get an excellent image of Kennedy in crisis management. I wonder if there's another Kennedy, though, that we're not seeing here, and that is the Kennedy who provoked a lot of these crises. We've talked about the Bay of Pigs, but there's also afterwards, there's Operation Mongoose, there's the assassination plots against Castro, and by the way, the latest discussion on the Diplo is that the person that was responsible for JFK's assassination was Castro himself,
Yeah,
and
of
after all,
course.
he had good reason.
Yeah, of course.
There's Ortsack.
Of course.
Yeah, right.
Castro spelled
Great,
backwards
wonderful
is-
name,
is-
CIA,
Yeah,
so cool.
and in Vietnam, we
Yeah.
go from 600 to 16,000
Yeah.
advisors. They're not really advisors, they're engaged
Yeah.
in military activities. There's the support for the Strategic Hamlet Program. There's the ZM coup.
Right.
We seem to have a leader who, while I'll give you, is excellent in crisis management, excellent in diffusing these crises, also seems to be quite skilled at creating a lot of these
Yeah.
same conflicts. And so what, how do you deal with
Yeah.
that?
I think that's a really important issue. Kennedy is multifaceted, let's say, okay? And I think there's a couple of things here. First of all, with regard to Cuba, one of the amazing blind spots that Kennedy and all of his advisors had, really, is that the activities they did in Cuba had no relevance for U.S.-Soviet relations. Okay, now part of that is just big boy thinking, right? Here we are, it's the superpowers, and we can do what we want in small countries. Kennedy really doesn't ever, there's some places, but mostly he doesn't ever really appreciate small countries. He gets into asymmetric warfare and understands that and so forth. But Cuba, in his mind, is hermetically sealed from the Soviet Union in April of '61. And so part of the deal is that, you betcha, I am not sending the troops in. We're going to be stuck with Castro. But just because I'm stuck with him, it's not going to be like I'm going to let him have a nice life. He's a thorn. He's stuck in my craw. And he can't, this little pipsqueak country can't do that to the U.S. So what will we do? Well, we'll give these people something to play with. They also had what they call a disposable problem. What are we going to do? Disposal problem. What are we going to do with all these exiles that are pissed?
What trash can do you put the
exiles in? You got to give them
in?
something to do. Now, here's a really interesting thing. So Mongoose, which was essentially state-sponsored terrorism, right? Again, to show you the absolute different mindsets in Washington and Havana, we had this wonderful conversation with Mac Bundy, Kennedy's national security advisor, essentially asking him your question. And Bundy, who was very patrician and very brilliant, but could be, shall we say, a tad condescending every now and then, turns to
Pompous
me.
ass would be fairly
Turns
close
to me,
it.
and he was a good friend, and we really liked him. He was a wonderful contributor, but he turns to me and almost metaphorically is patting me on the head and says,
There, no.
and says,
yeah.
Janet, don't you understand that Mongoose, and this is a direct quote, is, quote, a psychological salve for inaction, i.e. politically we got to do something. Well, later when we were in Havana and we met with a number of people in the intelligence service there and the president's office and so forth, and when I gave them Bundy's quote, needless to say they were appalled that they said, let Mac Bundy come here, and if you're blowing up factories and you're torching sugarcane fields, you could be forgiven for thinking that it was a cousin of war. So They didn't, I mean, it's big boys doing little things. And it's the same thing, again, with the advisors. You know, he's got to do something. He's not yet a second-term president. He's got to he's got to throw bones out there. So he throws 16,000 advisor bones. But I do think that Kennedy had a line in the sand for combat troops. That was something quite different. So I wouldn't say he created crises, but I think he, as a political animal, he was stuck with doing some things.
He had a superpower view of everything. I mean, this is why he wanted to be his own Secretary of State, and not to deal with places like Vietnam and Cuba and that sort of thing, but to deal with the Soviet Union. And after the missile crisis, it's all about reversing the nuclear arms race and about doing something significant about the Cold War, but with Khrushchev, the guy who's been in the trench with him in this particularly frightening event. But I thought you were going to say, on Kennedy's advisory group in the Cuban Missile Crisis, the guy who knows the most about the Soviet Union is Llewellyn Thompson, Tommy Thompson, who had been the ambassador there on 2 different occasions, was fluent in Russian. I mean, he just knew, he was part of the old Russian service. He knew all this stuff. There was only, as far as we can tell, one guy in the room who spoke any Spanish, and his responsibility, this was Ed Martin, Assistant Secretary for Inter-American or Latin American Affairs, whose job it was to be the State Department guy in the meetings where they were contemplating how to assassinate the Castros.
And Mongoose.
So that's the empathy for directed toward Cuba, which is, you ought to know a little Spanish because you can kill him a lot more effectively, versus what's Khrushchev going to do if we do this, he'll do, and then what'll he do? But Kennedy never, in fact, God, there's just a tremendously poignant letter Jacqueline Kennedy writes to Khrushchev, says it's my last letter in the White House, so it's November 29th or so, and then she's, this is one of those things that drove Bobby Kennedy up a wall, forcing Jacqueline out of it. Well, I mean, she doesn't live there anymore, Anyway, so she writes this letter out by hand. It's in the Kennedy-Khrushchev correspondence on the State Department.
Letters,
and it's on that's true. Dear
To who is this letter?
Khrushchev.
Oh, it's to Khrushchev.
Yeah, so Jacqueline Kennedy to, and it's Dear President Chairman. I mean, she wasn't on all these subjects. She shows it to McGeorge Bundy, who has it typed up and makes a couple of little, but it's as if JFK wrote this letter, because she says, my husband and you had a special understanding. My husband and you knew how close we came to total annihilation. My husband, and the thing is that my husband and you know is that you've got to keep, quote, the little people in line. You can't let the little people start wars, because that could spread and escalate until the big people get involved, and we know what that would involve. I think she got that from her husband, either implicitly or explicitly. JFK had really no sense that Cuba was an island occupied by 7.5 million Cubans. It was an island occupied by Russians who had paved over some places and put some missiles up, and they must need Cubans to, clean their toilets or something, but they really don't count in the overall equation. And as a matter of fact, of course, what we've found over the years is everything that happened in Cuba mattered. The Russians were pushed into it every step of the way. Once the decision was made, everything that the Russians did was in a response to the very aggressive stance that the Cubans wanted to take, up to and including Castro, writing to Khrushchev, said, the attack's about to come, the invasion's about to come. We hereby volunteer to sacrifice our entire population for the good of the world. So if they invade, I don't know if they will, but I'm 95% sure they will. I urge you to nuke the United States. And we'll go down with it, but Cuba will always be remembered as the cause that saved world socialism. I mean, that kind of fanaticism, I don't know what to call it, fanaticism. I mean, it's a commitment. Kennedy had no idea of anything like this. And the Vietnamese. After the Tonkin Gulf thing in August of 1964, Johnson thinks he's got to do a little, kind of drop a few here, drop a few there, because he's got an election coming up against.
Signal.
That's when the Vietnamese concluded that the war to the death had begun, right there. So they take their women and children, they ship them out to the countryside, they begin digging tunnels and begin raising their children underground, because they knew of no instance in which a big country would attack a small country and not use everything in its power. And so they assumed that they would be nuked. But they won't get everybody, because some of them will be underground. I mean, this degree of, Kennedy didn't understand it, Johnson didn't understand it.
It's another example of the U.S. thought they were signaling, the Vietnamese thought they were getting killed. A little asymmetric perception as well as power. And it's very difficult for policymakers, senior policymakers of large countries, to get into that mindset of a smaller country. When we were, decades after the missile crisis, when we were doing our work with Mac Bundy, Ted Sorensen, Robert McNamara, all the people that were on the XCOM, when we were doing it with regard to the Soviet Union and Moscow, they were banging on our doors saying, I want to come, I want to come. Once we changed the location to Havana to learn about the experience on the island, it was totally different. Basically, their first response to us when we talked about this with them, in one way or another, was they're bit players. This is in the late 80s and 90s. They just didn't get it. McNamara did, briefly. He'd forget it, and then we'd remind him that he got it, and then he'd get it again, and then, and so forth. But it's a very, very hard lesson. It's very hard, for example, to imagine Obama making, he's got to be very careful with all the spoilers and stuff, and it's hard to imagine him making a credible speech that would be received well, where he would be talking about the security concerns that Iran has. Hard to imagine. Now, here's a question for you guys. Could Canada do that? Could Canadian politicians make an argument for taking the perspective of a smaller country?
As long as it's Israel, yes.
Well,
no, the
could they?
Foreign Secretary says, no, Israel, no.
In principle, or, what do you think?
I think that's a distraction we can deal with later. Do you mind?
I'm interested, so I'll deal with it later. Yes, other questions?
Do you think that's by focusing on Kennedy, his exceptionalism, his black swan opinion, do you think by just having that focus, we're kind of in danger of reconstruction, that narrative of history that focuses on the actions of great men?
Yeah.
Very good question.
I think the way we look at it is it's easy to underestimate the difference an individual can make. And I would let the Kennedy-Johnson juxtaposition sort of sit there as an example of as close as we know how to get to drawing a reasonable and data-based conclusion that if Kennedy had survived Dallas, not gone to Dallas, if they put the bubble up over the limo, whatever, anyway, he doesn't die, and he's not impaired in some way. That you don't get what? You don't get the Vietnam War. You probably get an attempt to normalize relations with Cuba. We could talk about that another time, I suppose. But you definitely get an attempt, at least until the coup in Moscow in October of 1964, to try to bring the nuclear arms race under some kind of rational control. I think that's... So does that mean that events don't move the people? No, it doesn't mean that at all. And we can't be sure. All we're doing is talking about likelihoods based on what we see in the data. However, if we take our own advice seriously, there's a lot of black swans lurking out there. Well, but it's in the nature of a black swan. You don't know about it. It isn't just something you think is low probability. It's something you haven't thought of yet. Some event, some series of events, some this, some that. Kennedy's assassination is one of those things. 1 minute he's waving at the crowd. The next moment, the entire TV-centric part of the world is sobbing. Done.
You've got those sort of two forces, let's say, in historiography that, really put a lot more emphasis on the structure and the constraints.
Zeitgeist.
And the zeitgeist and all of that, and the agent, the great man, maybe great woman even, occasionally, part of it. And, if given a forced choice, obviously we lean much more toward the agency part. But clearly the two are so inextricably entwined. I mean, people don't operate in a vacuum. Kennedy knew the constraints that he had. I mean, in his dreams, he would have loved to have done a lot of things, but he knows he can't. He knows he can't even begin to do some things till a second term. So he's constrained, but the constraints are larger and smaller depending upon some of the forces and personalities of the people. And some people can push, make a wedge and make some room for some things, and some, are more constrained. The other thing that I would say that for us pushes us to really focus as much as you can on the person is that if you're doing that, you have to learn about the milieu that this person's working in. So you don't ignore that. You don't ignore that he has a LeMay to deal with and so forth. But the other thing is that every single senior person in policy decision, whether it's in the United States, Vietnam, the Soviet Union, Iran, Cuba, East Germany, every place we've ever been. The psychological experience of these people is that they had choices. They could have done something different. Now, maybe they're all delusional, but I don't think so. I mean, and they sort of say to us, well, if I couldn't have done any decisions, why am I here? What am I doing? So the combination of the psychological reality of the people in those positions and to us the importance of how individuals can work differently within a similarly constrained environment. For us, that's sort of where the action is. It's really interesting.
Good question. Anybody in here know who did it?
God, he's incorrigible. Ay, ay, ay.
No, I mean, if you learned it here first, you could control the flow of information, and you could make this anniversary last forever. Isn't that what you want? No, it's not what you want.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.